Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Mastering Retention Podcast. Again, I'm Tom Hammond, your host and co-founder of UserWise. Today, I am really excited to have Francesco Fontana on. Apparently, I can't speak anymore, but yeah, you're in Helsinki now, right?
Yeah, I am. It's cloudy and the winter is coming.
Yeah, working
So
at Savage Games, which I think everyone in the industry is, actively watching and excited to see what kind of shooter you guys come up and put together. But before we delve into things today, I know we wanted to spend some time talking about testing retention, which, as we are on the Mastering Retention podcast, gets me super excited. I always like to ask, what's your story? Like, how did you end up in games, and how did you end up, where you are today?
well, this goes way back. I think the last years of my high school have been like the most interesting for like knowing what I wanted to do next. I always wanted to be a doctor, like in medicine. And
Dude,
then
me
I ended up,
too. Me too.
and then here I am. But then the thing is that like I thought that was a great option. I loved the problems of problem solving in medicine, and but then I realized that I wanted to do that only because it seemed a valuable and safe career. Then thanks to my older brother that showed me that also a career in games was possible. And since he knew my passion, I decided to shift my focus. So I studied design right after high school, and I started working in games right away. Really, like the first year, I collaborated with a indie studio called We Are Muesli. They are still active and expanding, and they are doing mainly narrative games, escape rooms, all kinds of cool stuff. Really really nice stuff. I really miss working with them. And in the meantime, I became also a journalist in the video game journalist. So I could talk to all the developers and getting my foot in the door for all kinds of stuff. And after my studies, I started working at Wargaming Helsinki for about a year. Then the studio closed, and I went to Rovio, where I continued. I worked on Phoenix Rangers, which was a soft launch game, a puzzle RPG. And then I led a prototype team for some time before joining Savage, where I am senior game designer, mainly working with metagame systems, economies, and everything I can do to help, really. It's a startup.
So, you guys are obviously working on a new game. I'm going to ask you some game economy questions because I love game economy design. You know, for someone that maybe doesn't have as much experience kind of designing those economies, thinking about a new game, like how should I be like thinking or planning about, the game's economy when it's maybe going through rapid prototype changes and things like that? How does the economy fit into that, phase of game creation?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And it's one I had to face very recently as well, since I've never been part before this time of a big team that was starting like a new game. So I had to do my usual job, but from the very, very beginning, rather than getting onboarded on something that was already done. So I could build all the foundations, and that's definitely one of the main problems that I faced. And my answer to that is that you should make the game playable always at all stages, even accommodating the needs. For example, if there's only one level where you shoot three guys, that those three guys need to like feel good to kill, and so the time to kill needs to be something, and the weapon needs to do some sort of damage. But don't stress too much about it, because everybody knows that the game is not balanced completely. And the bigger plan is what you need to work on in parallel behind the scenes. So, for example, as we were testing a level at Savage, I was okay, building some sort of draft game balancing, and then in the meantime, preparing tools and simulation tools to allow for simulating 1,000 playthroughs of that level, to see where the player might have died, what was the chance, and what I could do about it. But really, in a Friday's playtest, you don't really see that small chance, or you don't need that level of granularity to make the level playable. So to sum it up is just try to focus on what works right now, even though it's not perfect, and make the game playable, because that enables everybody to work on it. And then in the meantime, do your mastermind plan behind the scenes.
I like that a lot. Yeah, I've heard always play the build, especially when you're designing economies, because even though you've planned it out that getting that, finding that one diamond is going to be perfect or something, you actually play the build and it's just like completely underwhelming. And you're like, oh, I got to go back to the drawing board on when I'm actually giving players.
And it's fairly easy to just make something that works for a prototype, because you don't have weeks or days or months of play. You just have like 30 minutes. So you can balance an economy of 30 minutes, even though it's not gonna stay like fresh, or who cares? It's 30 minutes.
I like that. I like that a lot. Cool. Well, thinking again a little bit more on like this early stage prototype, like I've been working with a lot of game companies later that are either in soft launch or just about to soft launch. And really the purpose of a soft launch is to, as quickly as possible, figure out like, is this something that players are going to enjoy, and I can get that CAC below my LTV so that I can actually scale this thing up and drive it home before I spend a ton of time integrating my live ops tools and all those other pieces to get ready for a global launch. I want to very quickly figure out like, do I have the retention to be able to support this player base? Like, is it going to be fun? So this kind of idea of retention testing or retention optimization comes in. So, when I say that, like, what does that actually mean to you?
Well, I think like that's kind of the $1 million question in a way, like how to approach that problem. But I think like the simpler the game, the easier you can test your, the earlier you can test your retention, and the more complex it is, the later. And it doesn't mean that if you get bad retention numbers after your earlier testing, doesn't mean that the game is not working. It just means maybe that it's not complete. So understanding when the game has enough systems or enough content or enough gameplay elements to be tested, it's probably the ultimate question. Like and that is really complex when you are in a pipeline with like in a huge company with 20 prototypes in the next to you, ready to make it. And it's really hard to present and explain also to like people who need to make the call. And it's much easier to identify in a smaller company because the loop are much smaller. But anyway, like for example, if you need to test a hyper casual game, the retention of a hyper casual game, you can do it after a week or after a month of development, like depending on your hyper casual, because it's really like you press the button, the character jumps. There's not much to it. There are some very light systems, ads coming in, but the retention really, like, it's probably reliable after like after a short development time. But if you need to spend to test a 4X game or a looter shooter or an RPG, like imagine testing the retention of Pokemon Go when there's no way to catch Pokemon. There's just ways to, I don't know, or maybe there's way to catch Pokemons, but there are 10 Pokemons, or there's nothing you can do with the Pokemons after you caught them. Like it's much harder, right? So you need to test it further down the line, but you can still do earlier testing to understand if the small mechanics that you put in are working. And then when the time comes to look at the numbers, then they are at least reliable. You can look at the numbers beforehand, of course, but with a grain of salt, maybe.
Is there a good system in place? So I'm thinking of a studio that I've been, working with for a little while. They have a game. It's, I don't know, maybe like halfway done, but following good protocol, they soft launched it. And they're seeing maybe like 30% day one retention. top games that are, kind of similar are probably closer to like 50 to 60% done. They're, definitely far from where they need to be, but they have this huge like feature roadmap. But they also only have so much timeline from a funding perspective.
Yeah.
Is there any tips that you have to say like, okay, how much time should I invest in this? Because it's very possible that I build out all those features over the next 6 months and nothing changes. And there, still, and now I've squandered that time that I could have been, building another game that gives me a better, shot on the
Yeah.
goal.
Well, of course, like you can start testing things as soon as possible, and there's no really downside in that aside from using resources in terms of time of the people that work with you and the cost of doing that. But like you can start fixing problems that are related to your retention as early as possible, but you need to understand whether those problems come from a lack of features or systems and or from the fact that the feature is not working or balanced. So to come to your question, then how do you prioritize? Then like I think you have different approaches. You can try to chase the what's standard, but usually like that's not very efficient for a small company, but it's very efficient for like a colossal 300 people company, because they can just pump all the features right in as soon as possible and then fixing problems with them. Or so you can so as I said, you can either slam all the features in as soon as possible and see what happens, or try to understand what feature has the most impact. And in my experience, like especially at Rovio, I noticed something that was a bit unusual to at least what I thought at the time, that we added a few features that were supposed to improve day 7 retention, which was what we wanted to improve, because we reached more or less the target for day 1. But what happened is that the day 1 and day 2 improved instead. So what happened there? And the kind of the how do you say, like the result of that train of thought was basically that players would see that there's more to the game, so they're like pulled towards day 3, day 4, day 7, even though they're not really using or engaging with that feature until that day, but they're still pulled. And I think that's what happened in that specific case with with Phoenix Rangers.
Do you think there's ever a case to use like user research, within this realm, like, in-game surveys during a soft launch or something like that?
Yeah, of course.
How would you go about doing that?
Well, it's a big topic, but definitely you should do user research as soon as possible, even before having a game idea, to understand everything about. Okay, well, maybe that's a bit too early, but once you have a rough idea, you should understand your audience as soon as possible. And through user research, you can do a lot of guessing, and then having a clear hypothesis that you can test. So if you don't have the clear hypothesis, because you don't have a clear idea what you're going to do, then you're never going to get like reliable results. There are a few ways that you can do it. Like I would rely on a huge set of analytics to improve anything really, like for any test, because the more analytic data you have, the more stuff you can deduce. But qualitative tests come really in handy to give you the first insights. But then I think you always need to confirm them with quantitative
analytics data. Yeah.
And that's often analytics, but it could be also a survey for 1,000 people, as long as it's not a survey for 10 people, because that's qualitative, not really quantitative. So I don't know, you could do a focus group or some playtest cloud testing where you see the players playing and ask questions to them, and then it gives you a hunch of what could be the problem. And then you open your huge data set of 100 million queries, and you see that, oh, there is a correlation, and then maybe you can do something about it. But asking the right question is usually like the bigger part of the problem.
Yeah. So do you think, or I guess, as a game designer, are you able to like write and do SQL queries? I know a lot of PMs are, fluent in SQL and it's kind of their go-to, or do you think game designers should also flow into that box, or do you, typically rely on more on like the BI folks?
Well, as any technical skill is useful to have, at least to the extent that allows you to talk with the people that know really what they're doing. So like I am able to prototype my own games to a certain extent, or for example, the simulator that I was mentioning earlier, like I coded with the help of the lead programmer. So it's always useful to have technical skills. I wouldn't say it's required, but it's definitely preferable. For example, like in Rovio, at some point I was on the verge of saying, okay, please teach me how to do this so I can stop bothering you. That's also valuable. And our BI engineer was amazing, and I had a great time. And I think what's really valuable in the collaboration rather than writing the query is the knowledge of statistics and understanding which tool to use, like whether a t-test or other fancy statistical tools to understand whether something is reliable or not. For example, how many players do you need to make this particular test reliable enough? 10, 100? Like if, for example, if the button presses, probably you need a way smaller pool than if the shooting is bugged or not.
Yeah.
So that the collaboration is always useful, especially when it gets into the most complex stuff. But I'd say that if you're a game designer and you work a lot with live operation, then you probably should learn it at some point, and I'll definitely do it as well.
Do you have a favorite analytics tool? I know a lot of like Xrovio, Xplaytika studios seem to be Amplitude all across the board from what I've seen, but curious if you have a favorite. Looker, Tableau, there's lots of them out there.
Well, the one that we were using in Rovio, and it's a custom one that's made in-house, it was really amazing, I think, especially in the potential that had in comparing data. And everything was really clean and pretty dashboards, and you could really easily add dashboards to it. So, well, I don't think I can go too much into the details of that, but I was really happy with that, and I deeply miss it. Well, not yet because we're not live, but I will deeply miss it, I'm sure.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, thinking a little bit about, I guess, shooter creation now. So I'm, really fascinated. Like, what's it like going from, like Phoenix Rangers was kind of this puzzle type game to a shooter game.
RPG, yeah.
Like, did you learn anything in the puzzle genre that is really translated well to shooters, or vice versa?
I'm not sure if about the genre itself, but I think the concepts of economy design for both are pretty applicable. Like they can be translated easily. For example, like Phoenix Rangers was a turn-based game, right? So what happens when you need to balance real time? My take is that the only thing that changes really is that instead of having one turn, you have fractions of seconds or 1 second. And then you measure the balance second to second. In fact, the term DPS is probably not new to you, damage per second. And that's how you go about it. You just fragment it as much, like as small as possible, and then you take it from there. So for example, to balance a weapon against an enemy, really it's the time to kill. So how many seconds to kill this guy? And then you can calculate mathematically what's the damage per second with the reload speed and the fire rate and the damage of the single bullet. And it gets more granular and granular, but really it doesn't make that much difference from you press a button, you deal some damage. It's just more complicated, but the concept is really translatable. And the game economy is really the same, because the meta game could be like a bunch of systems interacting with each other. You get some currency, you sync it somewhere else, and it doesn't matter if it's about building a base or if it's about modding your weapon. The math is really the same. So as a designer, you're probably flexible enough to apply the concepts to both worlds. There is a lot of learning and that needs to be done to handle this complexity or to consider it completely. For example, DPS, if you're talking about a weapon, is only it's not exactly representative of the damage per second you do on a longer amount of time, because you need to factor in the fact that at some point your guy is going to reload the weapon. So effective DPS also factors in the reload of the weapon, and same for the enemies. So I think the learning curve is in finding or catching these differences rather than finding new concepts per se.
Mm. When you're, thinking about that economy design, I'm thinking about back when I had Ethan Levy on the podcast, and he was telling me a little bit about when he was designing Legendary Game of Heroes for Network, and he was kind of lamenting on the fact that they didn't really take the right amount of time, and he just wished they would have spent an extra day or two thinking about the game economy, not just like 3 years out, but 5 or 10 years out, because they had these elder players that stuck around for 3 years, and they'd basically like maxed out everything. They'd gone through all the meta economy designs and things like that. And, he was going, if we just started on day one and we'd planned to have these additional systems kind of kick in 3 years or 5 years or whatever, and then it just adds so much additional lifespan. When is it appropriate to spend time thinking and planning that far out and what those systems might be, or what they might look like, versus I look at like Hungry Shark World. They ran into some game economy issues where then they just released like a new game mode that kind of reinvented the economy. World of Warcraft kind of does this with every one of their expansions, right? They just kind of like reset the stuff that matters, and it gives them a chance to kind of, completely break the old economy, which we don't care about anymore because everyone's, moved on to this next area. Is there a right approach from a, long run free to play perspective?
Well, I think like in the case of World of Warcraft, like my intuition is that that is done also to push the players to the end game as soon as possible, so that they can play the latest, coolest content. In fact, the curves from classic to retail are completely different. Like the speed to get to level 16 retail is absurd compared to classic.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's the reason why they want you to play the latest only, because there's so much. But regarding like easier examples, I think you don't have necessarily to plan it out, as long as you try to create isolated economies. So there are two ways of using resources, or well, more or less at least. You can use a resource that is used in many places, or you can create a resource that's used only in one place. If you do that, then you can add as many parallel systems as you want, because they don't interact with each other. Yeah. Because you use gold only to buy food, and you use blue gold only to buy water. And as long as there's no transition between these currencies, then these systems are isolated. And in this way, it becomes modular, and you can pop pieces in, pop pieces out, and you can keep adding. And that's one way of doing it without planning extensively. The problem arises if you use your currencies in many places, because, for example, if you played 5 years, then you have a like way different income of that currency, and a way different. You can hoard the currency, or the currency gets inflated, and you have all these kind of problems. So my take is that one should probably build systems in a way that they are fairly isolated, so that at the moment you want to create an expansion, that expansion becomes relevant only for players that are at that point. And then all the previous resources are used, or either are not used anymore, or they're not relevant. But for a new player, the new player doesn't see the later game resources, they just see the early game resources. So it's fine. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's
I think so. Is there a good, so like, using those kind of one-off currencies for certain things, I can see the value in doing that, but I could also, from a maintenance standpoint or keeping track of all the things that are going on in the game, if you keep adding all these different currencies and things, you know, does that add a lot of complexity and maintenance? And 2 years in, after you keep adding all these things, do you need to recycle some of them? Is there like a reasonable amount that like we should keep this many in the game at once? um I think about like Magic the Gathering. I think one of the big revelations they had was, let's cycle sets and retire them from over time, so there's only like 4 active sets at any given moment. um One, because it encourages people to buy the new stuff, but it also allows us to change the meta and whatnot. And then we don't have to worry about balancing and all this stuff against all these old things that, you know, might still be floating around. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. Like keeping the meta fresh is always like, but that's a very different thing, because in for example in Magic, the cards you get your first day of Magic are still somewhat relevant the last day of Magic. It's not like they are less relevant, but the currency or the weapon you got in your first day as a shooter player is probably completely useless on your 30 days day of play. So as long as the currency naturally, or the content really naturally flows out or becomes irrelevant and relevant at different points of the player journey, I think you're really fine. But also, if you think about how events are often handled, so there's the event currency that is
Yep.
valid for that event, and then it's retired and gets translated into something else, either some other parallel points that you can use to do something else, or you can translate it in something else, really. But the point is that you can put it and retire it for a weekend, and since it's an isolated system, you can do that. Of course, you should have. I'm not saying you should have an inventory of 100 currencies, but rather, let's say you decided 3 is a good amount for the player to juggle. Make them
Yep.
relevant and irrelevant at different levels throughout the player journey.
I like that. So let's talk a little bit about live ops and currencies and whatnot. Do you have any tips and tricks or experience where, hey, we made this live ops event, and in that event we created, I don't know, experience coins or something like that, and they're only going to be relevant for the duration of that event. How would you go about making them meaningful so that players actually want to accumulate those experience coins?
Also, there is definitely a trend of getting the live ops events as soon as possible in the player journey. So I think there was a tendency some years ago of saying, okay, the events are only for the end game. But I believe that now, as soon as you're ready to play, you can participate in events at your own level, and kind of the event is fragmented in a way that you can compete or participate in it at any point. For example, in the case of puzzle RPGs, in Phoenix Rangers, there was like the equivalent of the Titan for Empires and Puzzles. So a monster that the guild had to fight, and it was for a limited time. That's an event. So in that event, low level players and high level players could participate no matter which point of the journey they were at. They were contributing in different ways, and there were prizes for different kinds of tiers. Of course, the lower level prizes, we can do it so that they were getting resources more useful for that level of play. So, I didn't get the first prize with all the coolest stuff. I still got useful stuff for my level of play. And then the top dog with awesome monsters, they could get the first prize, which was relevant for the point of the progression they were at. So again, I think it's the underlying topic here is understanding exactly which point of the player journey your player is, and then anything can be relevant for them if you design the game in a way that's like let's say proper. Because you need this currency. Here's an event where you can get it. You can participate in it. You don't need to be level 5 million. You just go in and get the stuff you need, and that's really, you create the need for that, and then it doesn't matter if it's from a live ops event or your standard progression. But maybe like one thing we could briefly touch upon is how do you create that need, and I think it's super interesting to kind of understand that you need to design a balanced progression. By balanced, I mean that sinks and faucets are more or less on the same level. So you get as much as you spend. However, if you manually or by some mathematical tool of your choice offset that at different points of the player journey, then you're effectively either giving more that they can spend or less that they can spend. So they're starved or overwhelmed. And if you keep this imbalance in control, it creates really interesting points where at some point, I thought I had all the food in the world, but now I need it. Let me grind these levels so that I can compensate. And I think that's one way of creating the need for your currency, aside from the aesthetics of having the coolest gun or the coolest new skin or gear, which is really powerful as well. Yeah. And both they should go hand in hand, most likely.
I like that a lot. I just started playing Diablo 2 Resurrected with some of my buddies, and I grinded a little. I think it was like Nightmare Countess for a little while, and I had all these Tal runes, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm loaded up." And then, some of my friends came in. I was like giving out Tal runes, and I go to like make a weapon, and I'm like, "I'm out of Tal runes already." And I had this like plentiful, and now I've got to go back and grind some more Countess or whatnot. So it's a fun time. Looping back real quick to that, event design. I've seen games do two different things. So, I think one of the hardest challenges that I see with running a live game is you always have these different cohorts of players at different stages of the game, right? You have your elder players that are at the far end of the content, right? And you always have new players coming in, and then you got all the other groups in between. If I want to create an event, do you think it is better for me to try to design the overall event to kind of accommodate all those different groups of players? So, I designed the top reward to be for those elder players. They'll probably be able to get it. And then I, run the numbers and say, okay, well, for the new players, they'll probably be able to get yay far into the event. So I'll put something nice there for them to get, even though they, don't get to the high. Or I see others that are like, okay, I'm going to create a completely segmented event. So my new players are going to get, this version of the event that is win 10 big jackpots, and you get, 1 million coins overall. Again, slot game here. But for my elder players, it's going to be like win 1,000 big jackpots. And if you do that, you're going to get like 2 billion coins for like the top reward or something like that. And so it's like a very different challenge, but different reward level scaled more appropriately to like where those players are. Like, is there a good way to go about doing that? Or does it highly depend on, the players and how much they're maybe talking to each other? Because, would they get upset if they see that they have a different version of that event or whatnot, if that makes sense?
I mean, if there are different levels of the progression, I think it's going to be all right. But I think to answer your question is like, we need to understand what kind of audience we're talking about, because several different audiences perceive competition in very different ways. And that's the first step. For example, an audience might really badly react to seeing that they are number 5 million in a leaderboard. Like really, like that could be
disheartening.
Really daunting. Yeah. And another, they could say, oh, I'm gonna spend my life and money on this game to be the top. And maybe that's encouraging to them. So understanding the audience is really the first step for that, and everything really, any game development topic. But after that, after you understood the audience and the kind of competition they like, if you're still in doubt, then I believe that giving the fairest chance to win, or the most celebration, because the chance to win is the same, but the celebration of being first, like the best of the worst, rather than being okay among the very top ladder. It's still it's probably better if you think about how the Hearthstone ladder works.
Mm-hmm.
It's really that they subdivide legend players and not legend players, and that's just a way to make you feel like you're not just one in a million, unless you are, and then you become a legend player. But that's one in what is it, 10,000 player? I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, I feel like I posted about this at some point. I can't remember exactly which game. It might have been like Coin Master, but like you get in and they like introduce you to like the wall after you've been grinding for a while, and then you're, you know, number 100 out of like 100 million or something, and you're just like, well, that's disheartening. I'm not going to chase after that anymore. Versus, you know, if they grouped you into, you know, the bronze league or something like that, and now I'm number, you know, 40 out of, you know, oh well, I don't have that much further to go until I'm actually number one of this group.
Yeah, I think that's always more effective, because it makes your progress more noticeable.
Yeah. So are you a fan of, or have you ever heard of the Tower of Want principle?
The Tower of?
The Tower of Want?
I'm not sure.
Okay. So again, this is Ethan Levy, but Joachim Akron actually had him on to talk about it on the Elite Game Developers podcast again too. But he gave a GDC talk, which is definitely something I would recommend everyone to do. And the general idea with the Tower of Want is to really get to the baseline of like, why are players doing something? Why do they want to progress? Why do they want to do this level? Let me see if I can explain it a little bit better. So it's basically to help game designers to kind of create these long-term goals, because like with a free-to-play game, like ideally I want players to be playing, you know, 10 years from now. And so you kind of break down, like if I did the Tower of Want for, let's say, school, like why do I want to do well in school, or why do I want to study so I can do well in school? Why do you want to do well in school? So that I can get into a good college. Why do you want to get into a good college? So I can get a good job. So I can get a house, I can get a family. So you know, you end up outlining these like long-term goals of like, what is this person actually trying to do? And you can do that same thing within, you know, your game development. So you have these like series of short and long-term goals that are kind of like escalating on each other. But as you were kind of outlining the concept of like tiers versus like the overall leaderboard with everyone on there, it just reminded me a lot of the Tower of Want. So I'd be curious if you've ever used a similar framework.
I'm not sure if I used it as such, but I definitely like the understanding player motivation is one of the key things to start designing your game. And that can go from understanding what they're after, like in terms of like what does a shooter player or an RPG shooter player that likes fantasy, what do they want first, for example, or what does a World of Warcraft player want in the very beginning of their Warcraft career? They want adventure, they want a cape. I want personally a cape. In every single fantasy game I am into, I just want a cape, and then I'm good. But anyway, like we use player traits, 12 traits, sorry, at Savage, and it's been super useful, and it informs us it informs and checks whether we are doing a good job on a daily basis. Like we often go back and see, okay, the research says this, so it's probable that this mechanic really appeals to them, or they would like to crack the system instead of being tutorialized. And understanding player motivation is super key to do that. And I think you should always design the smallest goal possible, as well as shining a big light at intermediate goals and the long-term goal, so that you create a natural ladder of things to do.
Hmm.
But it could be even as small as kill the enemy in front of you, and then you get a celebration. Then you kill multiple enemies, and you get your weapon levels up. Then your weapon levels up, and you can put more. It does more damage, or you can put more mods on it. And then you want to get the mods, but that can escalate it from just killing one guy. So yeah, it's definitely, I can see why it's a super useful tool. I'll definitely look into it.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, I think the last little bit, I'd love to just talk a little bit about shooters and how you, because we see all these top end shooters like Call of Duty Mobile, a little bit different than like some of the battle royales that are out there, but on track to do over $1 billion in revenue this year. Obviously, they've got a strong IP and a really strong team and stuff. But there's just so many of these shooters that are just doing amazing things, and it seems like a super competitive market and everything that's going on out there. For folks that have always had this passion for shooters, they've been playing Halo or Call of Duty or whatnot their entire lives, and they dream of bringing these great experiences to players. Like, what sort of advice would you have to people that want to get into creating shooter games without giving away the secret sauce at Savage, of course?
So, well, play as many of them as possible, no matter the platform, like console, PC, mobile. Of course, probably if you want to research controls, and mobile, if you're developing on mobile, is probably the best choice. But nothing prevents you from exploring the genre completely 360. And also, like, these are like something that I think should be dear to any game designer. If you're developing a shooter or something else, don't be fixated on the genre, because I think inspiration or learning can come from any other game. And actually, that maybe is a way to make it novel and to spice it up a little. But there is like the good thing about those famous shooters is that they're famous. So there is a lot of material that you can study on, a lot of deconstructions, a lot of spreadsheets. Even I saw the construction of the time to kill of Destiny 2, which was this really huge spreadsheet of data. And I'm not even sure if it was released by the developers or by some crazy fan, but it was super useful and interesting to know. And so since they're famous, there's a lot of material, and you can do a lot of research on it. Even looking at what's the update history that they have had, it's super useful. But again, like, if you don't find your niche along these huge top players, that is probably not going to have a great time. So finding also where like unexpected opportunities or unexploited opportunities, that's also probably something for product people to figure out and for designers to tap into.
Yeah. There was a book by one of Procter & Gamble's old CEOs that was co-written with a consultant that he used while he was CEO there, to really change the way they did innovation at P&G. And one of the stories that they shared in it was the development of the Big Bertha Golf Club. And so this is back in the early 90s. And traditionally, a lot of the golf club manufacturers would, try to innovate on top of what was already there for the existing golfers. And so this company that ultimately created the Big Bertha said, well, we don't really want to compete with these other companies. So let's go look at the 90% of guys that don't play golf, that are in that age group and every income bracket and stuff, that should play golf, but don't understand, like, why don't you play golf? Well, turns out hitting the ball is hard, and they don't want to look like an idiot in front of their friends. And so ultimately they created the Big Bertha, which is this golf club that's got this like huge head, and it is very difficult not to hit the ball pretty well when you're swinging the Big Bertha. And so they ended up bringing all these guys into golf that had never played because, now I don't look like a complete fool. But not only did they do that, but a lot of the existing golfers had that same problem. They just thought it was the fact of life of playing golf that, they just weren't that good and they just had to like get better. They didn't think that there was anything out there. But because they focused on the players that didn't play golf, they were able to actually gain that insight, and they probably wouldn't have gotten that by just talking to the existing golfers. And I always thought that was a very fascinating story that I think can translate into games. Like if I look at Candy Crush,
Absolutely.
probably not going to get that many insights from players that play Candy Crush of like what's wrong with it. But what about talking to those women that by all accounts should be playing Candy Crush but don't? I'm guessing, may not be a fact, but where did Homescapes and Gardenscapes come up with this meta idea? Probably it was from these players that were like, why do I want to play these? Like, what's the purpose? Why would I play this saga map of endless levels? Like, there's no reason behind it. And so Homescapes gave them a reason. But then even among those players, Lily's Garden came in from Tactile Games and said, well, you just upgrading your this old mansion isn't really that meaningful. Let's like add some rich story and narrative on top of this. And so it's like this progression of problem solving and stuff. Do you think that there are similar opportunities within like the shooter genres to focus on, hey, by all accounts, you should be playing Call of Duty Mobile. Like, what don't you like about it? Like, why did you play and churn? And see if there's some sort of problem in there that you can actually fix for a meaningful number of players to kind of expand the genre as a whole, if that makes sense.
Well, that's absolutely like a valid product strategy. I think like it depends if your audience is the same as these players or not. That's a starting point at least. So you can understand, like if you want to bring players from COD to your game and you're doing a PvP competitive shooter or a battle royale, then it's definitely like something you could look into, or you can take a subgenre that's different. For example, shooter on rails, or looter shooter, or action like RPG shooter, or something else. Like, yeah, like if you have a shooter on rails, like my guess is that the audience is going to be quite different from fast-paced, like frantic Call of Duty PvP shooter. It's still a shooter, so there is some sort of appeal of that shooting a gun to zombies or other things. So definitely, like you can either find your niche or try to see if you can bring the audience from a competitor. Of course, like if you're a small studio and your competitor is huge, then it's like a big challenge, and there are probably other ways. But yeah, like I don't think really, there's nothing you can't find out with user research. It's going to be just only hard and takes probably a long amount of time. But if you keep researching, you'll probably find something interesting enough. But on the other hand, it's going to be really hard to start thinking about a game without some sort of audience in mind. And also developing a game without an audience in mind, like finding your audience, to me sounds always super risky. Because what are your design choices like driven by? Like, why are you designing this thing in a more hardcore or casual way? Like, what's even the point if you don't know what's the audience?
So you mentioned you kind of use 12 traits for that. Like, how does that process work, or how do they come in and actually help you figure out what this niche or this audience is?
So, well, the tool is handled by the founders. So I just get the research, and the way I use it is by reading it and trying to make a presentation out of it if it's really complex, and it's like the data they have, or the facts and insights are really well structured, so it really helps you while designing something to just open the research, look through it, and see if it fits or not for the various player personas you have, and so on.
That's awesome. Yeah, if you're listening, definitely check out 12 Traits. Joe's awesome. Yeah, I actually live in Madison, Wisconsin, and he graduated from the UW Wisconsin. So we kind of got that Midwest here in the U.S. Founder perspective. So love those
Nice.
guys. I think they're doing amazing things, and they work with pretty much all of the big gaming companies and stuff, and everyone loves them. So if you guys are looking for better ways to understand your audiences for new games, I highly recommend them. One last question before our unofficial question. You mentioned like playing a lot of mobile games. If you're designing for a mobile shooter or something, it is really useful. Do you think that there is value in playing, let's say, shooter adjacent, or if I'm designing a puzzle game, like a puzzle adjacent game or something like that, to just better understand things? So as an example, maybe I would say like a MOBA is sort of like shooter adjacent in the same of like playing League of Legends Wild Rift or Pokemon Unite or Brawl Stars or something, to get a better understanding of like what controls could look like, comparing those to say like Call of Duty mobile controls.
Absolutely. Like I don't think there's any downside to studying more. That's for sure. But if you're strict on time, then I still think that's valuable, especially if you can find key people that talked about those things. As I said, like when I was talking about the Phoenix Ranger experience, the concepts are very easily transferable. Most of the times, the more abstract they are of course more transferable. And maybe that's where the innovation comes from as well. I was really impressed when Genshin Impact came out, on the way they handled the cross-platform controls and make them feel good on really both platforms.
Yeah.
And they did a very solid work on mobile. The controls are perfectly fine, to me at least. And on PC is just like a perfect execution, I think, on 3D 3D control.
Yeah.
3D
Genshin
movement.
was interesting for me. Like I loved it on mobile, and then I played it on PC, and it was like even better. And it was actually hard for
Even
me to go
better,
back
yeah.
to mobile.
Yeah, well, of course, the mobile as like for such an like it's a pretty immersive game, I'd say. If you're into the genre and the fantasy atmosphere. So
Yeah.
I see the appeal of the PC, but I was really impressed by the fact that it was almost as playable on mobile.
Yeah. No, I agree. I was like, I'm playing Zelda here. It's amazing.
But especially the prototype stage, like the exploration like that on adjacent genres can be really fruitful. Even
Yeah.
if you modify something as small as the way you show damage.
I love it. I love it. Cool. Well, I know we're about out of time here, so I've got one last question, because we are the Mastering Retention podcast, and that is, what's one tip, trick, or lesson you've learned over the years to help increase player retention? How do you keep players playing for longer?
Let's see. Let me think about it a little. So I think about what worked for me. Well, of course, optimizing the tutorial can be a huge factor. And by optimizing, I don't need just, pushing the player through the tutorial, because obviously if you have a tutorial of 2 boxes of text, everybody's going to push it through, or 99% of the people. That's going to be very useful. So optimizing the tutorial, by that I mean also giving the player just enough information for them to be hooked up and to be interested in, and that's highly dependent on the audience. So player would like to figure things out, tell them there's something to be done with their weapon. I don't know, you can upgrade here your weapon, check out the mod system, whatever, and then they'll go, maybe they're hooked. Or players that need a little bit more hand holding, then you can guide them and give them all the tools they need to deeply understanding their game. I think for day one retention, one of the biggest challenging is understanding if the players are dropping out because they don't like the game or because they don't understand the game. So at least that's something that I would focus on for day one. So trying to understand which one of those two it is, and a lot of user research before and after you are doing your tests.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the before part, because it can save so much time.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's often underestimated.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. If people do want to get in contact with you, is there a good way for them to do that?
Oh, they can reach me out on LinkedIn or yeah, I guess like LinkedIn works really well. Or
Perfect.
yeah. And thanks
Sounds
for
good.
having me. It was super cool.
Thanks so much. All right. We'll talk soon.
Talk soon. Bye.